I'm happy to be here. Greetings to all. But I want to say a special thanks to the director, the co-directors of Open Air, Professor Guamanam and Professor Jeremy DeBeer. Jeremy, I think you may recall, I think I met you while I was at Nigerian Institute, Advanced Legal Studies, when you were there on sabbatical. You came visiting with Chile, when you had just started Open Air, I also want to thank the director of the Center for Law, Tech and Society, the entire community, Dr. Yvonne, my sister from Bakassi Peninsula. I'm Nigerian, so those who are in will know that joke. They took our oil from the peninsula lawfully through the International Court of Justice. But they are our brothers and sisters. We're very close, historically and otherwise. Thanks to everyone for your presence, for taking the time in this time of snowmageddon and things like that to be here. As Chidi said, my topics on poverty, agency, and resistance in the future of international law, but from an African perspective, and I framed that in the context of global ferment. Not that you have never had global ferment. International law, as we've been told long ago by Hilary Charlesworth, is a discipline of crisis. We thrive on crisis. Crisis has defined the discipline. So it's not as if this is the first or it will be the last, but so it's a reflection on work that I've done over a while, over 3 decades now, but perhaps with a more contemporary spin to some degree. So, to my mind, this theme invites us to envision, from, of course, all kinds of perspectives, and, of course, taking into account history, the likely orientation of future international and global order, and in the light of the various global crises facing us today. Some more intense than others, of course. Some of the more recent events of quote-unquote constructed great significance, and I use this term advisedly. The fact that some crises have more significance than others is not natural. It's made up, right? Sudan is even worse than Ukraine, but somehow all we talk about is the Ukraine. So there is an element of making up stuff, always, right? But some of them include, of course, Ukraine, the hot war there, what the Chinese Economic one has referred to as a cold peace between China and the US, the sustained Israeli attacks on Gaza in retaliation for the October 7 Hamas attack. Other of important crises do, of course, exist, as I pointed out, none the least in the Congo and the Sudan, both on the African continent. And some crises are not necessarily hot wars, but they remain crises nevertheless, such as the crisis of poverty and also the crisis of the season of African agency that has been going on for centuries now. So in this presentation, I seek to engage this broad theme from an African perspective and with a third world approaches to international law lens. I will attempt as best as I can. Chidi says I'm a prophet. Every Nigerian thinks they are a prophet and God speaks to them directly. But that's not what I'm going to do today. But I'll attempt to read this future for the transcripts of past and current diplomatic dramas and the historically discontinuous and continuous engagement of African peoples and their third world states with international law and order. Now, this is a difficult task, but certain historical continuities and discontinuities will readily meet the trained eye, especially the trained twill eye. And this helps us elevate the platform from which we gaze into the future, albeit in outline. Now, the three main questions that I dealt with, I will deal with, are the extent to which future international law can reasonably be expected to promote much more than it has ever done, or even effectively the well-being of African peoples amidst the continent's palpably intense socio-economic and governance crisis, at least in a general sense. The first such question relates to poverty. The second relates to the extent to which future international law is likely to permit and promote the exercise of much more local agency in the governance of African society. And thirdly, the extent to which future international law is likely to allow spaces for Africans themselves to resist those aspects of international order that are disadvantage and worse still, that harm them. Now, three of the concepts that feature prominently in the questions that I've just articulated require some explanation. I don't have all the time in the world, so the explanation will be brief. So poverty. Everybody thinks of poverty in terms of $2 a day, the World Bank's metric. But I don't use that metric alone on its own. In addition, I refer to any incidence of fundamental deprivation or serious lack of basic needs: food, water, shelter, education, and the like. That's my conception of poverty, at least as I use it here. As I use it here, the term agency refers not to intentions that people have in doing things, but to their capability of doing it in the first place. So in articulating my understanding of agency, I'm obviously indebted to the great sociologist Anthony Giddens' much referenced work on structuration, the way in which structures constrain agency and at the same time may allow agency, the way in which those two interact. Thus, as another scholar has correctly stated, the concept of agency is fruitfully understood as the capability to deal with an issue, question, or problem. For both Richard Falk and Balakrishnan Rajagopal, it is to a combination of state action, and this is important, a combination of state action and social movement resistance, social movement protests, not one or the other, that one must turn to understand the meaning of resistance in international legal order. So it is this approach to resistance that shaped my understanding of that term as I use it here. That approach has also shaped my conception of the nature of the targets to which such resistance ought to be directed in appropriate cases, as inclusive not just of powerful states, but also of certain non-state global actors, for example, international financial institutions and transnational corporations. I also draw, in my treatment of resistance, on Upender Bakshi's germinal distinction between good and bad social movements. Social movements are not inexorably good. I'm just going to skip more definition and go straight for time to the three, if you like, pillars of my discussion today. So I'll begin with poverty. Any credible consideration of the likely extent of future international law's commitment to the significant reduction of poverty on the African continent must begin from a serious analysis of the existing evidence in this regard. It must therefore proceed from recognizing the historical reluctance of the international order to promote actively the socio-economic well-being of most Africans. As the late great Canadian Ivan Head, my own beloved doctoral supervisor at the greatest Canadian university on earth, UBC, once noted, I hope nobody takes it outside with me here. As they once noted, that the fact that international law can or indeed should contribute to development is not in question. But it must always be remembered, this is Ivan speaking, that some of the applications of international legal principles, designed as they often were in the industrialized countries, are not always in the interest of developing countries. This is Ivan, not me. Okay? Long ago. So if, interestingly, I think he founded IDRC, an early funder of open air. So if, as Ivan and others have shown us, international law has been traditionally insensitive, at the very least, to the cause of development and poverty reduction, there's little evidence that it has, for the most part, significantly altered its posture today. So, against that background, how likely is it to change course? Will this future international legal order be able to contribute more effectively to the urgency of growing the real incomes of African peoples and radically increase access to other socio-economic benefits for African peoples? Will it be able to contribute to the imperative of enthroning far more socio-economic equity within African states? So 2 lines of inquiry are here suggested. The first relates to future international law's probable relevance or irrelevance to the struggle for increased real incomes and other socio-economic benefits on the continent. The second relates to greater socio-economic equity within African states. Now, of course, the investigation of these 2 questions is important in order to fully appreciate the likely nature of future international law's relationship to the struggle to reduce poverty on the continent. But space-time does not allow me to consider both questions here today. As such, I will only consider one of them, one of the 2 sub-questions, and that sub-question will be the question of growing real incomes and international law's possible contribution or otherwise to it. Now, and I will do that, and of course, as you will appreciate, I can't do treat the full gamut of that question, all the entailed sub-questions. So I'll choose one thing in order to illustrate, and I'll choose the issue of the possible elimination of the trade-distorting agricultural subsidies that many of the far richer countries of the global north have for decades maintained in the global trading system, while at the very same time ensuring that most African countries effectively open up most of their own markets to imports from these far richer countries. This is an issue that is governed by World Trade Organization's General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Now, given the fact that a sizable majority of African people, especially in the rural areas, depend on agriculture for their subsistence and for wealth creation, and considering that a number of these countries are almost entirely reliant for their national incomes on agriculture, any factor that negatively impinges on the volume and prices of these products and the volume of those exports to the global north poses a highly significant obstacle to the struggle to substantially increase the incomes, the real incomes of ordinary African peoples, and also of the national incomes of the countries they belong to. So this is a poverty reduction issue, a direct poverty reduction issue. So for me then, the relative failure, at least to date, of international law, international trade law, to deal effectively with these trade distorting agricultural subsidies has made an important negative contribution to the continuing poverty of far too many Africans. Now, yes, there's the so-called Nairobi package of 2015, but maybe in discussion we can talk about it, but it's far too little, far too late. Now, of course, it is of course important that we realize that the maintenance of a national agricultural productive capacity is as sensitive an issue in the global north as it is in Africa. Many of these global north countries have expressed the fear that towing the path dictated by global trade rules might ruin or devastate the agricultural sectors. So this is a politically sensitive issue in many of those countries. But so are the other trade issues that the global south have been forced to comply with. The political sensitivity does not lean only in one direction. The negative impacts do not also only lean in one direction. Now, I'll just keep a detailed discussion of the Nairobi package and just say that what the developments with regard to these, the failure to deal effectively with the elimination of those subsidies and to deal robustly and timelessly with them, what that indicates is that despite the possibility of mild reformism and mild change in the orientation of future international law's engagement with African peoples, what is most evident to the trained twill eye from these developments is the law's historical tendency to reflect and respond much more effectively to the economic worries and demands of the global north, and to be at the same time much less responsive to the socio-economic challenges facing most third world peoples, including African peoples. Now, given the fact that the much more robust and rapid reduction of these subsidies should lead to reasonably increased incomes for a great many African farmers and their states, the likelihood that future international law will contribute much more effectively to the urgent need to grow real incomes on the continent and increase access to other socio-economic benefits on the continent is called into question by the reluctance of the much more powerful states of the global north to eliminate these export subsidies. Now, of course, there are other domestic and even other international factors that will shape any increases in the real income of African peoples. But this allegorical story that I'm trying to tell, albeit not in as much detail as I would love, about international law's relative insensitivity to the necessity for the elimination of this practice of offering extensive subsidies to global north farmers is highly instructive. The continuity of this kind of general trend over almost all of modern history and the snail speed of current international legal reform in the area does not inspire as much confidence as one would like to have in the likelihood that future international law will contribute effectively to the reduction of poverty on the African continent. As suggestively, there is little in reality that suggests that the more powerful states with the near or medium future be willing to make the kinds of fundamental economic concessions to African states in such areas without extracting from these African countries certain countervailing concessions that would tend to detract from the gains of those anticipated cuts to global north subsidies. History teaches us that the more economically powerful states, indeed almost all states, hardly ever give up their more powerful positions in a willing fashion. As such, barring any sudden seismic shifts in the reconfiguration of global power or in the receptiveness of the public and or ruling elites within global north states to these far-reaching pro-global equity ideas, wrought perhaps, that is the seismic shift, through China's great rise, the greater room for the maneuver or maneuverability of such poorer states that will be created by China's great rise, bearing such seismic shifts, which even now has still not occurred, these more powerful states are more likely to continue in the ways in which they have historically acted. The recent election of Donald Trump to a second term as US president only heightens anxieties in this regard. Of course, this is not to say that these states, global north states, will not make any concessions whatsoever to African states. That's not my point. My point is they will not make fundamental concessions, the fundamental concessions that are needed. They haven't made them in the past. I don't see why they'll make them in the near to medium term future, bearing a shift in global power. So what I'm doing here is centering power relations as important in understanding this. It also configures actually how we understand the issues to begin with. On agency, let me move to agency. The question here, of course, is to what extent international law in the future is likely to permit or promote the exercise of much greater African agency in the governance of their own societies. It is to be understood here that what we're talking about is their own societies. Oftentimes, it's almost as if we're talking about the governance of the US or Canada when we're talking about the governance of what South Africa wants to do, what Nigeria wants to do. This is the governance of their own societies that we're talking about. While restricting to a minimum, because I'm not naive, so I'm only looking for a minimum, the current overbearing role and influence of outsiders, like France, for example, in West Africa, in the constitution and framework governance of these societies. If, as Giddens has shown, the term agency is best understood as the capability of doing things, this question can also be framed in terms of the extent to which future international law is likely to permit or promote the capability of African peoples and their states to chart their own features and to self-constitute. Here again, any credible inquiry into this question must understand and begin with the history. Are there historical continuities that meet the eye in this regard? And what kinds of discontinuities, if any, can be observed? As Anthony Angie, the great Anthony Angie, I hasten to say, as he has shown, despite certain discontinuities that exist in the exact and more specific forms and techniques that are deployed, there is indeed a historical continuity from at least the 16th century onward of international law's tolerance, if not active support and imbrication in the negation and erasure of Global South agency, including African agency. At root, this denial and subjugation of African agency has taken the form in each era of global interrelations of an assault on the capacity of African peoples to govern their own lives and chart their own futures. In the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, this negation of African agency was much more formal, much more extensive, much more suffocating than it currently is. That point has to be considered. The era of formal European colonial rule over most of Africa, in which nearly every aspect of the life of almost every African society became marked to a great, if uneven, undulating extent by a coercive and often brutal superimposed colonial order. Quite obviously, that specific era of formal rule has now ended. However, coloniality endures. In this regard, it's instructive that till this day, the word imposition, or its synonyms, remains the key word when African leaders themselves and scholars describe the continent's relationship to international institutions or to the global north. For example, former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, a key African leader even now, once noted that when we, that is Africans, thought we had regained control of our destiny, and when we believed that we had earned our rights to join the rest of the world as equal partners and discuss mutual cooperation on the basis of equitability, we discovered that the position of our continent in the world had been disadvantageously fixed and predetermined by numerous factors which, for want of a better description, we call colonial legacies. That's the meaning of coloniality. 3 years later, in 2023, just less than 2 years ago, Kenyan President William Ruto noted that Africa, quote, underline, still carries the scars of colonialism which remain visible in the economic and institutional dependencies that continue to hinder the progress of the continent. As remarkably, African scholars, many of them, and these are not all Twi'lers, in fact, only one of the three I cite are Twi'lers, in the third world approaches to international law school. They're not even mostly national lawyers. So Michael Chege, the great political scientist, George Aite, and of course Joe Olokonyango, have expressed similar views. There's almost no realistic dispute about this. Now, so for example, Olokonyango is convinced that for many African countries, IMF restrictions are in fact edicts, which reminds me of military rule in Nigeria, what I grew up under, given the latter little choice and almost no room to maneuver. So maneuverability is a key point that I'll return to toward the end of the talk. So in terms of predicting the future of international law in this respect, at a minimum, there is yet insufficient cause for optimism, at a minimum. As the great B.S. Chimney once argued, the Indian scholar, if care is not taken, the ongoing, less formal, less extensive, and less suffocating processes via which international law and institutions impose upon, or at least exert strong compliance pressure on, African and other global South states risks being formally transformed into a more formal, more extensive, and more suffocating global regime that will be akin in many important respects to the formal systems of colonial rule that severely constricted African agency in the 19th and 20th centuries. In fact, Canada seems to be under a similar threat as we speak. As he has put it, a network of economic, social, and political international institutions has been established or repositioned at the initiative of the First World, and together they constitute a nascent global state whose function is to realize the interests of transnational capital and powerful states in the international system to the disadvantage largely of third world states and peoples. The evolving global state formation may therefore be described as having an imperial character. I may not go as far, but the point is well taken. Now, in my own view, this assessment of the direction in which the international legal order is moving means that it's not moving in the right direction, at the very minimum, okay? And it's likely to continue to move negatively, at best, maintain stasis, which is not a happy stasis. And this assessment receives support from the example of the framework, the location of the framework economic governance of African peoples and societies. That location of the macro governance is not in Africa. I think you have to be extremely naive to believe that it's in Africa. The reason the French are being toughed out of every single West African state where they have intense military, political, and economic influence right now is exactly because of this point, right? Mind you, what we speak about here is not micro governance. We're talking about the macro rules and frames. We're not talking about the micro, the implementation, the details and specifics, but the frames are not made by Africans. As I argued, some might laugh, incidentally in 1998, when I was still teaching at Carleton University here in Ottawa, it is clear to, at this point, remain salient, which is saddening. It is clear that the framework governance of African societies has been effectively relocated to international financial institutions and certain countries of the global north. It has, in other words, been externalized. As economically weak as almost of these African countries tend to be, and in light of the reality that you really cannot maintain a viable economy without the stamp of approval of these institutions, and we can discuss that in Q&A, how the mechanics of that. You really cannot escape being labeled as a pariah state if you depart even slightly from these frames. The prescriptions of many of these bodies become edicts, in the sense that, almost in the sense that Chimney meant it. So it means that African states must always strive to comply, to come to terms with a largely predetermined set of policies that tend to be imposed on them from without, by external forces, by a loose, but don't get it twisted, cohesive consortium made up of the IMF, World Bank, and key G7 countries and their banks. Now, in almost all cases, and to this very day, these African countries are required to remove social subsidies, meaning greater poverty through a lack of agency, privatize key industries, including water, greater poverty, and retrench significant proportions of their public employees, a la Elon Musk. Regardless, so the US is undergoing a third worldization. Regardless of one's view about the reasonableness or otherwise of these policies, you can have your views, that's not my point. The point that I want to make here, that I want to leave you with here, is that despite the usual declarations about these policies being, quote, homegrown, they have in almost every case been imposed. That's why they all look alike. They have been imposed from without. Okay, and so you can, for example, go to the New Economic Partnership for Africa's Development. My good friend James Gatti has done detailed work showing precisely it's copy and paste. Precisely, but it was announced as something African countries developed for themselves. So, again, the evidence doesn't seem to me to suggest that much is going to change in the near term, in the medium term. For the long term, hope springs eternal. This is where a small but significant degree of optimism, that is on the point of agency, may be warranted. For like it or hate it, China has risen. And China's great rise and the now full-blown China-US rivalry, and with it, the geopolitical competition that it has generated, may open up significant room for maneuver on the global political and economic plane for global South countries. In the ways in which that same type of rivalry, not the exact kind of rivalry, but the same type, during the Cold War, gave third world countries significant room for maneuver. If you're a student of international legal history, you will understand that the era of the new international economic order. Umut Ozu at Carleton has written a fantastic book, which I reviewed in the American Journal of International Law, showing precisely some of this, what happened during this time. And when you read, he went to, it was an archival work, and you listen to the things that third world countries did then, you'd be like, wow, right? These are unimaginable even now. The notion of use cogents was invented by the third world. Most international lawyers don't even know. That was an African idea, right? That they pushed through effectively in the law of treaties at the time because they had room for maneuver. So it matters. The global structure matters. Unipolar world does not favor Africa at all. So I'm not one of those who's extremely critical of China's great rise. From an African perspective, for the US, of course, I understand them. I work with them. My office is stone throw from Congress. I understand why they're frightened. I'm not. I'm African. But this room for maneuver is not going to be as useful or beneficial or fruitful for every country evenly in Africa, or even in the global South, the middle powers, or the so-called middle powers, stand a greater chance of benefiting if they play their cards diplomatically correct. So if you go down, US is now belatedly building a massive railway in the Lobito corridor. They're basically replicating China because they understand that, you know what, and that's what Trump doesn't get. China is going to fill any space that US aid leaves behind. That's just what's going to happen. So, of course, Trump is not known to be a great thinker to begin with, what more strategic thinker, but that's what's going to happen. So this new cold peace for Africa is a good thing in the end. I do not comment on China's domestic political system. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the space with which their power, increasing power, now they have 25% of UN assessments from almost 1% in 1970. That tells you a lot if you understand UN politics. If you have the purse, you push the policies. On resistance, very quickly. Now, if the resistance of African societies to certain aspects of international legal order will be central to Africa's escape in the near or medium-term future from the clutches of gross poverty and disadvantage, then the extent to which that future is likely to be transformed by their resistance matters much. So do the forms that such resistance must take if it is to be effective. As I noted in my introduction, the concept of resistance that I deploy is taken from the writings of Richard Falk and Balakrishnan Rajagopal at MIT. As such, the extant discussion focuses not merely on dissent expressed by African leaders with respect to the nature of the international legal order, but also on the resistance mounted by African peoples, especially as manifested in the efforts of their social movements, or those social movements that engage in pro-African struggles on the international plane. An assessment of the extent to which future international law is likely to allow necessary room for African resistance can be either more or less optimistic. Scholars like Professor Joel Ngugi, now Judge Joel Ngugi of the Kenyan Court of Appeal, have, at least in the past, been less optimistic and maybe even pessimistic, saying that you cannot basically pour new wine into old skins, old wine skins, and expect, change. But even a scholar as critical as Makau Mutua, or for that matter, B.S. Chimney, have been somewhat optimistic. They have exhibited what my old teacher, not that she's old, but she taught me in olden times, Professor Karen Mickelson of UBC, has described as hope, not faith. Hope, not faith. They are not the same thing. African and 12 scholars do not have faith generally that international law will definitely work to reduce poverty on the African continent or accord them more agency or allow them more space for resistance. But they have hope. They have hope in the possibility under certain narrower, specifiable circumstances of meaningful, even if only moderate, reform and revamping, hope that change can happen, not faith that it will happen. They are two different things, okay? Because they don't have faith because they understand the power that global power exerts. I don't have time to state in detail what all these scholars argue, but I must remind you that buoyed by this hope, African scholars and leaders and diplomats shook up the United Nations, shook up international law in the 70s and early 80s, and remade international law to a degree in their own image. Use cogence. The right to development was a Senegalese idea. Many examples I can give you. The moon not being subject to any country or space, any country's sovereignty. All these were African ideas that resonated in that previous era of great power competition. And so Niels Gilman has tended to refer to the 60s and 70s, the policies or the changes that Africans pushed during that time as an unfailure, meaning they neither failed nor succeeded. They didn't succeed as much as they wanted, but they didn't fail. So part of what I'm getting at is that Africans need to prepare themselves for a coming 70s and 60s, back to the future. It's going to happen, right? So what are you going to do to seize that moment, to grow your real incomes, to escape from poverty? And yes, US aid being devastated is bad in the now, but aid has never developed any country. Show me one. Okay, other than Germany, which was after 1945, which was a very particular unhistoric moment, an event. Has never happened since Germany. Okay. Excuse me. All right. So, now, I don't have time to offer the examples, but I'm going to tell you the conclusions that I drew from those case studies in terms of how African resistance can enhance significantly its chances of success. And the first of the 2 points I want to make quickly here is that coalition matters, right? Coalition. In the examples that I gave, for example, the HIV/AIDS movement and the reforms to WTO intellectual property rules, scholars are here, that happened. The reason they worked wasn't because Africans and other third world countries were pushing. They worked because there was a coalition between African peoples, African leaders, African diplomats, and social movements in the global north. So you matter, all of you here. You matter. Pressuring your own countries. That's how, because I like to look at the historic evidence, that's how the change has happened. In the 60s and 70s and early 80s, I keep talking about, a few on specific issues, a few global north countries stood solidly, read Umut Ozu's book, behind the global south as well. In particular, Ireland. And that is often unsung. Ireland has not received nearly as much praise for what it did and continues to this day to do for the global south. And the reason is not far-fetched. It has its own history of colonial rule by England. So it understood in its gut what global south countries were fighting for. So those kinds of coalitions have to be sought after actively. And that's because that's how meaningful change has occurred in the past. And those coalitions have to be transnational, right? Of necessity, have to be transnational. My wise Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria say that if you want to be a teacher, you better go to the next school nearby and look at the head teacher's head. You know what they're looking at? Right? That's how your hair is going to look like 30 years after. Are you getting the point? You learn from history and experience. Not, just talk, what my Nigerians call cho-cho-cho. There's a lot of talk. Look at the actual data, the actual historic evidence, and that's how you know what is likely to happen in the future. So, coalition, transnational. Those are the two. And let me move towards, because I can speak all day. It's always a risk giving a platform to a professor. Now, so moving toward a conclusion, it is useful to provide, I think, a assessment, overall assessment of the vision of the broad position that most African peoples are likely to occupy in the international legal order in the near and medium term. It's a less than clairvoyant reading, but it's one based on the historical evidence. despite the greater space for maneuver on the international plane that may be afforded to these weaker African states or the third world states, especially to middle powers from those regions, by the emergent US-China Cold Peace. From the perspective of the bulk of African peoples, international law is unlikely to undergo any really far-reaching or fundamental transformation. Not in the near future, maybe in the midterm. It is unlikely to be transformed in the near or medium term into a normative order that serves African people much more effectively and serves global power less, much less. Future international law is as unlikely to be altered so as to foster, to a much greater extent, the kind of much more equitable global economic order that is envisaged by the campaigns of African peoples for much fuller elimination of export subsidies, agri subsidies. Similarly, future international law practice is also unlikely to function in a way that much more greatly enhances the self-constitution and self-governance of African societies, as long as it remains relatively silent about or even tends to promote the denial of African agency in the governance of their own societies. That future will, for the most part, remain as largely insensitive to the yearnings of African peoples to exercise more control over their own lives as the past and present global orders have been. What is more, without more of a focus on deploying the kinds of transnational social movement strategies that I've talked about, which have historically increased the chances of success of these African movements, Africa is unlikely to improve upon its historically suboptimal record in significantly affecting the play of global politics in ways that will improve the lives of most African peoples. Yet, the adoption of this kind of innovative strategy, talking about innovation, is unlikely to win for Africans the kind of fundamental concessions from the far more powerful states of the global north, at least not in the next 4 years, that are necessary for Africa and our entire global circumstance to experience rapid, robust, and sustainable positive change. So bearing any sudden, much deeper structural changes in the current ideational, economic, political, social power asymmetries in the global order, change will continue to be administered upon Africa and not really by Africans. And such change will continue to drip onto the continent in rather small, but hopefully incremental doses. And while it will levy a degree of structural transformation in world politics, even the current US-China Cold Peace is unlikely to immediately result in the kind of more deeper changes that are necessary and that are envisioned if poverty is to escape. Africa is to be much more ameliorated, or as the SDGs say, ended. Let me leave it at that. I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Okafor, for that very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. We were all hanging on to every word you spoke throughout that amazing lecture, so thank you again. We'll now open the floor for questions, discussions, thoughts, ideas. We have only 28 minutes before we're kicked out of this room.
Thanks to me.
We'll dedicate maybe 15 minutes for this exercise, and I'll ask us to be really brief when we ask our questions, and possibly take 2 or 3 related questions at a time, just so we maximize whatever time we have left. So let's find out who wants to go first, who wants to kickstart the conversation. Yeah, I see a hand right behind it. Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Professor Okafor. My question is, you discussed...
Please say your name so that...
Joshua.
Okay.
You discussed the role international order or actors play in kind of stalling economic growth in Africa. What role can improving intracontinental trade play some of the areas that need to be improved in intra-continental trade.
Okay. I thought you wanted to speak to the question. No?
Yeah,
I can respond.
Okay.
Huh? Okay.
Sokafo, thank you so much for, yes, you were right, we're hanging on every word. So, my attention has never been captured in such a long time. So, let me ask you a question, very simple one. Reflect with us what you mean by medium powers in Africa, or what category of countries fit that bill?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, there's another hand.
Yes, hello. So my name is Tammy Long.
Okay. Tammy. Okay.
So my question was, in discussion of when you're saying in terms of rivalry between China and America, and
Yeah.
if China's prevalence could benefit Africa in the long run,
Yeah.
could it not also be argued that because of the competition increase, Africa can take like a downward spiral, because what we see now in terms of China's influence, some of the negative of it. So in terms of in like Ghana, for example, where we see like mining or illegal mining, where it's kind of causing a lot of environmental issues in terms of trying to develop their own domestic policies. Can't like in terms of how Russia and China also have influence in Africa, actually curtail a lot of the development, because now Africa becomes even a greater power struggle for resources between the superpower countries.
Yeah. Great questions. Perhaps I'll start with Professor Guamanam, not because of rank. So you know, South Africa comes to mind, even though Nigerians begrudgingly accept that. You know, it is a BRIC country, original. It has I think, highest per capita GDP. Nigeria used to have highest aggregate GDP, no longer, because of a rapacious regime. There now, we're now number 5 in terms of aggregate GDP. Yes, only in 2 years we have sunk to those levels. So I wouldn't count Nigeria yet, but in the actual paper, I talk about Nigeria under new leadership. Perhaps has that potential, right? To be that. So Egypt, Algeria, maybe even Ethiopia, fast rising. Kenya certainly. So they're not all the same kind of middle. It's like the middle class, lower, upper, middle. Yeah. So that's the first one. Joshua, thanks so much. That's the vision, of course, of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the AfCFTA. It is, the potential is massive. But your second sort of question or follow-up kind of highlights why it has not been realized. So there's a lot of barriers, you know, some of which work is being done. For example, the Afrexim Bank in Egypt, African Import-Export Bank, has just developed an African payment system. So you can ship something from Nigeria to Kenya and you don't have to use the US dollar. Right? You can pay in the Kenyans in Nigerian currency, or the Kenyans can pay Nigerians in Kenyan currency. They just developed that, and it was, you know, an intellectual, a professor who heads that bank who innovated it. So we need those kinds of innovations because often Africans don't have access or enough foreign reserves in US dollars and all that. These are impediments. Migration problems, putting up visa requirements and things. But that is also, West Africa, of course, pioneered that in 75, although West Africa has, the ECOWAS has now diminished with 3 states kind of leaving. So free movement, there's massive amount of unaccounted for free movement and free trade on the level of people to people across West Africa that even the data, you know, Bloomberg and co don't capture and can't capture because of that singular thing of free movement and establishment. So there's a vision and a move to expand it, but it's proceeding slowly. What's happening? Every single year, 3 or 4 African countries announce visa-free waivers for other Africans, right? South Africa, unfortunately, will be the last to do so because it is the richest country. So it often happens when you're richer, you don't want to, you think everybody's going to come take your resources, right? So, but it will happen. We're there, but it's very slow. These are impediments. In the past, and happily there's been a seismic shift. It used to be because I was consultant for ECOWAS, so I don't just think. I actually use my hands in some of these things I talk about. And it used to be that if you wanted to achieve anything in ECOWAS in West Africa, because the French countries are the majority, the vast majority of West African countries, you needed to go talk to France. Yeah, that's what most people don't quite realize. You needed to on practice. If France doesn't sanction, it's not going to happen. That's the reason, for example, for 30 years, the common currency has never taken off. Because the CFA, the CFA franc, that West Africa is controlled by the French central bank. But that is shifting. There's a seismic shift. Once the military legations are gone, which they are mostly going now, those countries will have greater room for maneuver. And that's why I keep talking about greater room for maneuver. Some of these policy failures are not entirely the fault of some of these countries. A lot of them have a lot of fault, and I spend my youth fighting against them, domestically. So it's not that, and I still fight against them now. But there are a lot of, there's so much interference from abroad. Yeah, so these things need to change. Tammy, great question. Great question. For me, talking about the international play, the room for maneuver on international plane, but that's not to say that your question is off base. It's a very important question nevertheless. Will it do more environmental damage? My answer would be, since when did the environmental damage not be done? I mean, I went to a high school, boarding school in Jos, in northern Nigeria. And we used to go hiking around. The most important portion our teachers told us was not to fall into a mining hole. Are you getting me? And I went to high school where? So in the 60s, Jos was already mined out by the British. So let's quit talking about environmental damage as if China brought it to Africa. Having said that, that's not to say we want more environmental damage, but why do you think America is building the Lobito Corridor Railway? It's just to take rare earth metals out. So the point is, they're all going to want your resources, but on what terms? That's the point. And what exactly? So that's for us. That's a policy thing. That's for us to determine on what terms. And do we want to even sell it at all? Right? Ukraine said no to Trump. He wants to own their minerals. At least he's more honest. Right? He says it as it is. Give me your minerals before I give you weapons. That's what African leaders hear all the time. If you don't give us your minerals, you don't get this, you don't get that, you don't get that. So this is the real politic part of it. I spent 15 years at the UN. I just came back from Geneva on Saturday. So I'm not naive to the real politic of it. So the point is, I miss this real politic. Do we need a structural transformation that recreates room for maneuver or not? That's what I'm thinking about. So it's not as if there's not going to be a nirvana, when everything is going to be, we're all going to kumbaya and sing We Are the World. And no, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So I missed all that. What does Africa need? Greater room for maneuver, greater room to make its own decisions, greater room for pro-democracy movements on the continent not to be undermined because some power like France wants a dictator to remain in place. I can go on and on and on. I can give you specific examples if you would like. Yeah.
So we have just time for one short last question.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. I set my alarm.
I'll take the lady next to Damola for the last question. Make it short, please.
I have my alarm for 2 p.m. Okay.
Oh no, we have to leave the room at 12:50.
Hello, Professor. My name is Adora.
Oh, really?
Okay. I just had a small question about what you think African states can do individually or collectively in a combined fashion to organize and literally just fight this or act as a form of resistance to this limited international the limited hope that we have in international law. What role can African states themselves play? In what manners do you think they can organize? And states like organizations like the African Union, ECOWAS, what roles do these powerful, or at least supposed to be powerful organizations, what roles can they play? And what can each state do individually in the space?
Okay.
So just for information, Prof will be moving over to the CLTS lab after this session, so we will have time to talk with him one-on-one if we have any other questions. But for now, we have to leave the room at 12:50, so we'll wrap it up.
Okay. No, thank you so much, Ada. Again, I'm a huge fan of history, so you have to go back to what has been done historically. So in the 60s, the age of African independence, the first thing that was done was what? To establish the Organization of African Unity. So these are oftentimes the narratives as if, Africans don't think, right? They understood that without it, they had no chance. Without an attempt at collective solidarity, they had no chance because what? They were very weak, prone to manipulation, but what happened? Within 5 years, Lumumba was dead. Was it Africans that killed Lumumba? Nkrumah was gone. Was it Africans? Are you getting what I'm saying? So we need to understand history, right? So it's not as if Africans don't understand that I'm not been making efforts to unite. And I make no apologies for the misgovernance that many of them, for example, Mobutu, installed by who, has devastated the place. He didn't have to, but he did. The Congo, we're still suffering from that. But on the point of unity, that point has been well understood for a very long time, and steps have been taken. For example, ECOWAS was started in the 70s, right? To unite West Africa, and I think James Gatti has mapped 18 regional organizations in Africa, right? Including newer ones like the Afrexim Bank and things like that. I think it was even Soludo when he was central governor of Nigeria that innovated that idea, and all that. So that idea is on. I think that we need to intensify that, because that will not get you to the promised land. But without it, you're going to fall into hell. Pardon my biblical analogies. Okay? So that's my own view. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much.